This video will explore powerful ideas from Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan. From the power of words and ancient stories to the role of psychedelics, get ready to question everything you know about life. First, words are more than just talk.
You know, when you're actually asking the questions that are genuine questions, and people can trust you because of that. And that means that you're letting the words emerge as they come to you. And doing that with each word, that's a decision, you know, because you can use your language to manipulate, and you can use your language for your own, say, hedonistic purposes or to gain power. Or you can just say what you think. All of those different choices are a decision. That's a wrestling. That's a moral decision. And it shines in every word. And so it's super important. That's part of the reason why in the Christian canon, the word is the basis of reality. It's the process that generates the order that's good out of possibility and chaos. At a deeper level even is that if you're genuinely wrestling with your conscience, then you're someone who's chosen by God. And I think that's right. That's accurate.
Next, let's hear a story about Moses and the burning bush. Could it link spirituality with psychedelics?
It's interesting what you just said. One of Terence McKenna's lectures, he talked about a very profound psychedelic experience that he had where he was given this revelation that the world is made out of words, that everything is made out of words. He had just some sort of profound understanding of what words really mean.
Well, how much of the reality that surrounds you has emerged out of the realm of possibility because of what you've said? A lot. And you have this huge influence on the world that's all a consequence, almost all a consequence of what you've said. And so there's an insistence in the Judeo-Christian canon that the capacity that words have to shape possibility is akin or identical to the process that generates reality itself. And I think that's true. That's why in the opening chapters of Genesis we're described as formulated in the image of God. We're like a microcosm of the process that gives rise to order itself. It's a very different view than the bottom-up materialistic view of the Enlightenment and the scientific world. It's a different way of looking at things. It's the notion that what is in front of you is a field of indeterminate possibility. It's got some implicit structure, as the scientists insist, but it's open, and you grapple with it like you grapple with your consciousness in the morning. What confronts you in the morning is a field of possibility, and you approach that with a certain kind of orientation, and you use your words and your linguistic capacity to think to shape that possibility. And if you do that properly, you make the order that's good or very good. And that depends on your orientation. So in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which is an instruction manual, Christ tells his listeners how to orient themselves in the world properly. So he says, first, aim with all your heart at the highest good you can imagine. That's the orientation, to do what's right. So you orient yourself to the highest possible upward place. Then you make the assumption that other people have the same intrinsic value that you do. So that's your initial aim and presumption. And then, having that firmly in mind, to pay attention, as much attention as you can to each moment, to allow the words to come to you that best suit that upward aim, not to subordinate your language to your own machinations or manipulations or your own hedonistic desire, but towards what's right. And if you do that, then what emerges out of possibility is akin to the garden, to the original garden in Genesis 1, and it's the order that's good. Truthful language brings about the order that's good. And that's a very accurate way of portraying the role consciousness plays in bringing about reality. It's a good story for the psychedelic experience, perhaps, at least as an analog. So in the story of Exodus, there's a number of circumstances under which Moses has an encounter with God. And they're very useful stories to understand because they point you to how that can make itself manifest in your own life. So the first real encounter that Moses has with God is in the story of the burning bush. And by this time, Moses is an adult. He's left his home. He's gone out and he's got married. He's apprenticed as a shepherd, which was a very, very hard job in those days because shepherds not only had to protect the weakest and serve them, but also keep the lions and the wolves at bay by themselves out in the wilderness. It was a very hard job. And Moses has mastered this. So he's grown up and he's adopted a role that's like a standard social role. You know, he's a husband, he's a shepherd, he's an adult. But then one day he's out in the wilderness by the holy mountain, and something attracts his attention. And he goes off the beaten path to investigate. Okay, so that's the first thing, that's the first bit of wisdom to derive from the story. You'll have your role, and you should have your role as a socialized adult, right? So you're kind of a type that way. You've adopted this mature social role. It doesn't make you a full individual, but it's better than being immature and staying in your father's tent, for example, which is what Abraham does until he's very old. So something attracts Moses' attention, and he goes off to investigate. And then he sees that it's a burning bush. And so what's a burning bush? Well, it's the tree of life, and life is often represented as a branching tree. And it's on fire because it's compelling, because fire is compelling, and fire is alive, and it's a symbol of life because everything that is alive burns. That's what metabolism is. And so a burning bush is like life itself intensified to the ultimate degree, and that's what attracts Moses' attention. And he gets closer and closer to it, which means he investigates more and more deeply. And as he investigates more deeply, he starts to understand that he's nearing the depths. He's on sacred ground. He takes off his shoes, and that's an indication of his willingness to transform in identity. And he continues to investigate, and then the voice of being itself speaks to him from the depths. It reveals itself to him as the ground of being itself, and it transforms him into the leader who invites his people away from slavery and who stands up against tyranny. And so that's the story of Moses' baptism. And so what does that mean for the ordinary person? Well, it means that you need to grow up and adopt a role. You need to mature. You need to become an adult. You need to be a good man in your time. But then you have to pay attention to see what attracts your attention, what calls to you, because there's an autonomy about that, right? You don't get to pick what interests you. It picks you. And you can respond to that call and investigate or reject it. Those are your options. And if you reject it, you stay in your box. But if you follow it, something will call to you. And then if you investigate that, that will transform you. And if you investigate it deeply enough, it'll transform you into the person who can stand up against tyranny and who can lead his people away from slavery. And that's how God is defined in that story. God is the thing that calls to you to take you out of your role, that will shape the manner in which your psyche transforms itself as a consequence of your diligent investigation into what calls to you. That's one image of the God that's portrayed in the Old Testament.
Are you aware of some of the more recent work that's been done by scholars in Israel, where these guys have now come up with this hypothesis that the burning bush was actually, it was a DMT experience? Mm-hmm. And that the burning bush was most likely an acacia tree, that the acacia tree is apparently rich with DMT, and they think, the way you get a DMT experience is you smoke it, right? And that they had some method of achieving psychedelic states through this. And this is where Moses is encountering God.
I know about the theorizing, and certainly the case that people have been using psychedelic experiences for we don't know how long.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of years, no doubt. And they've had a profound cultural consequence. One of the things that a psychedelic experience does is amplify that sense of intrinsic interest. It strips your perceptions of their inhibition by memory so that you see what's there instead of your habits of perception. And so it's a way of amplifying what's represented in the biblical corpus as a calling.
Did psychedelics help humans evolve? This idea could change how we see history.
You go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are the oldest version of the Bible, the only version that I believe the only version they have in Aramaic of all those stories. And if John Marco Allegro is right, it all kind of makes sense that these people were having these experiences much like the Greeks were with the Eleusinian mysteries, much like multiple different cultures in the Amazon, all over the world have experienced these profound ceremony experiences that lead to these journeys into the spirit world, these connections with higher consciousness, this something that when you're experiencing it seems very, very real, but also very preposterous when you try to explain it to people that aren't experienced. With that understanding that that's possible, the world changes because now you know that that's possible. You could live your whole life and not know that the most shocking, profound thing in existence is 3 hits away. And all of a sudden you're in a completely different universe in 20, 30 seconds. And the fact that that is dismissed, that people look at it as like, oh, you're just escaping reality, and you're like, it might be the source of civilization itself. It might be the source of language. It might be the source of the expansion of the human mind over a period of 2 million years, the doubling of the human brain over a period of 2 million years, which Terence McKenna felt directly coincides with the shifting of the tropical rainforest turning into grasslands, which would force these primates to experiment with new food sources, and these ungulate cows that were everywhere that would shit, and then these psilocybin mushrooms would grow in their shit. Observed primates flipping over these cow patties, looking for beetles and grubs and things to eat. It's everywhere. Like, you can see it all over Africa. If there's something on that, they're going to try it out. And if these things are trying it out and they're doing this over a period of 2 million years, and they develop language and culture and weapons, and they start thinking about things, and they become different than every animal around them. And this was McKenna's stoned ape theory. And Dennis McKenna, who is, a legitimate scientist, Dennis explains it even better because he explains it with the actual mechanisms, the things that fire up when you encounter high-dose psilocybin experiences that would lead you to the development of language. Glossolalia, the connection of sounds and objects and bringing things together in a manner of communication. Also, they realized that in low doses, it increases visual acuity. It makes people more amorous, makes people hornier. They're going to have more sex. They're going to be better hunters because they could see better. They're going to be a little more sensitive to the environment. They're going to be more aware. There's like so many different things that happen that if you're thinking about what made people, it's a mystery. We want to pretend that we understand things because of the fossil record and this and that. But every now and then we find a new human that we didn't even know exists. So now there's a whole other branch of human beings that they weren't even aware of 20 years ago. Whatever the fuck happened that took us from all the other primates that are still here and made us this. It's pretty profound. And I have a feeling that psychedelics were at least involved in that process. And my belief is that the sweeping Psychedelics Act of 1970 that they passed essentially to target civil rights activists and anti-war activists. They wanted to go after the hippies, and then all this anti-war shit would just get stopped by sensible people. Then, Schedule 1, everything. Psilocybin, marijuana, all down the board, everything becomes Schedule 1, the most illegal of illegal things. All those people become criminals instantly. And they just threw water on the whole movement, and it worked. It really worked. It was Nixon and all the people that were in charge back then. If you look at what happened from 1960 to 1980, this confusing era of the 70s where the effects are wearing off, and then you get into the 80s and everybody's doing coke and they have makeup on and they have big hair and the music sucks. It's like something happened. What happened was they completely removed the very thing that had changed culture so radically from the 50s to the 60s.
Psychedelics are powerful, but Peterson says we must use them responsibly. Let's see the clip.
There's a different form of responsibility that emerges once you realize that you were constrained by a conformist box, let's say like Moses when he was being a normal shepherd, that you can step outside of that, but you don't step outside of that into worship of the golden calf like in hedonistic orgies. You step outside of that with a more conscious upward aim. And if the use of transformative technologies like psychedelics isn't accompanied by that framework of enhanced responsibility, then it can degenerate into a kind of hedonistic chaos.
Right.
And that's what the Nixon types were reacting to. They were terrified by it. And they had their reasons to be terrified because, as you're intimating, these technologies are unbelievably potent and destabilizing. Now, that destabilization can be used, let's say, for better or for worse.
Right.
And it should be used for better. That's complex. It's a very complex thing to manage. And so Carl Jung said that one of the main functions of religion was to stop people from having religious experiences. And what he meant by that was that a direct experience of the transcendent is enough to shake you to what he meant by that was that a direct experience of the transcendent.
Could you explain further, expand on what he was meaning by that? That keep you from having religious experiences?
There's another scene in the story of
But
Exodus.
could you expand on what he was meaning by that? But that keep you from having religious experiences?
And part of the danger of the hippie movement in the 1960s was a counter-social fragmentation. There's no unity of purpose. There's nothing but fragmentation. And part of the danger of the hippie movement in the 1960s was a counter-sociation.
Right.
Now, so you can imagine, and that's equally that everybody's exactly the same, and that's a complete totalitarian catastrophe. But you can imagine the opposite catastrophe, which is that, well, everyone's letting it all hang out and doing their own thing, and that's equally dangerous.
Right.
And so there's some balance in the middle. Well, that's that balance between chaos and order that we were. That complex social order can be maintained by something like mindless obedience. What you'd really want is enlightened responsibility.
Right.
Right. Now,
Right. That's a great way to put it.
Right. That's a very hard thing to pull off, though, because it means that you have to leap out of the box of social constraint and you have to take the responsibility onto yourself.